The Biden administration has struck a deal that virtually declares legitimate 170 Chinese companies that are trading on the U.S. stock exchange.
It's the latest, Brendon, in a series of Biden administration initiatives that are clearing the way for CCP corruption that will affect Americans directly.
I'm Brendan Fallon.
And I'm Lee Smith. And
we're over the target. One of the complaints so far about these Chinese firms that have been trading on the U.S. stock exchange is that they resist audits, whereas all other foreign companies that have been trading on the U.S. stock exchange have been open to audit by the SEC. So the big shift is apparently that these Chinese companies are now saying, come in, check us out, we're open, you can take a look, and it's all good.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, that's not going to happen. What they're trying to do is, the Biden administration and the CCP, they're trying to frame this as though it's a huge accomplishment for bilateral relations. Now when CCP-owned companies or CCP-affiliated companies come onto U.S. exchanges, they'll have to be open and transparent, and that's what the audits will prove. Unfortunately, that's not the case because the issue here isn't really about auditing.
I sense that there is a broader issue at play here, Leo. I know we're going to get into that. But why are these audits invalid exactly?
Well, it's not that they're invalid, but if we're talking about U.S. companies or EU companies, then audits would be very important, right? This is part of the regulatory process. However, when we're talking about CCP companies, we need to understand the governance structure of these different companies. Brendon, if you and I were to jointly, say, take a share in an American company, then that means that American company has an obligation to us as shareholders. This is not the case with CCP companies, right? What are CCP companies obligated to? Advancing the party. They don't have the same responsibility to shareholders that American or European companies do. Therefore, that's why this auditing issue is missing the bigger picture, and I'm afraid it's missing the bigger picture intentionally.
That is an important aspect of this, and I think it's something that gets missed. It's broadly missed, the fact that the way things operate in China under the CCP is vastly different to the way things operate in America, and it's understandable that many people get confused. A company operating in China is beholden to the CCP. Its intellectual property, its blueprints, it's all available to the CCP. The CCP can access it in the name of national security. This is something people understand as a vast difference between a Chinese company and an American company.
Well, that's a very good point that you made about national security, because in fact, this is going to turn out to be one of the loopholes, right? All of these Chinese companies will be able to turn around and say, like, well, as part of this agreement, we don't have to show you something if it touches on Chinese national security. And of course, so many of these companies are involved in the business of the Chinese Communist Party, whether this is military hardware, say a company helping produce parts of drones, or a company involved in biotech, which we know is also a big part of the Chinese defense industry. So that in itself is going to make a lot of auditing. Again, auditing isn't really the point, but if it were, this would make it more difficult, because a lot of the companies will say, sorry, we're not allowed to share that with you since it touches on vital Chinese national security interests.
I mean, it's understandable that the people, like the average person who wants to invest a bit of money in the stock market, wouldn't really understand how the Chinese Communist Party operates. But the US government bureaucrats who are making these deals with the Chinese Communist Party, they should know how the Chinese Communist Party operates. So why don't they?
Well, I think they do. First of all, you're exactly right that most regular independent investors, they don't understand how the Chinese Communist Party operates and the relationships between companies that list on foreign exchanges. They don't get the amount of control that someone like Xi Jinping has over these different companies. So most Americans don't get it. And nor should they have to, because if they're on exchanges, they assume that these companies are entirely legitimate. And so what this agreement has done, it's papered over the different problems with these CCP companies. It makes them all look legit when in fact they're not. And why, again, to repeat this point, because it's very important to understand, they're not about responsibility to shareholders or to the company. Their primary responsibility is to advancing the interest of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, that may intersect with making a lot of money, some of it which may be thrown off to individual investors like you or me, but that's certainly not what they consider its primary responsibility.
And it often seems that it's not just Chinese companies that have the interests of the CCP at heart. It often seems the case that it's American companies that seem to be geared that way as well. The one notable example is many financial institutions in America, particularly BlackRock, has come under fire. I know not so long ago, I think it was in August, the AGs, Attorney Generals of 19 states in America, sent a letter to BlackRock trying to hold it to account for its pushing of the environmental social governance policies, which tend to work very well in the CCP's favor, because in the environmental aspect, if they're trying to push out fossil fuels, what's replacing it is things like wind and solar, and a lot of that infrastructure is coming from China.
It's a very important fact that ESG is a way to channel investment into the Chinese Communist Party, because the infrastructure, as you say, for renewable energy, we're talking about wind turbines, we're talking about solar panels, we're talking about the various rare earth minerals that are needed to build electric vehicles and the batteries for those cars. It comes from China. That's what a lot of what ESG is doing. And we also have to understand the further plans of places like BlackRock, where they want to get into China. They're pushing money there so they can also pull money out, in particular by setting up all sorts of funds and investment vehicles for Chinese nationals. So they're doing both at once. They're pushing American money into China so that they can take Chinese money out as well.
And that's an example of how business in America can often work in the CCP's favor, and often it seems in an intentional fashion. Another example that comes to mind is in the scientific community. I published a documentary last year. It was about the origin of the coronavirus. I spoke to a physicist named Richard Muller, and he spoke about his experience in the earlier days of the pandemic, when he was trying to look into the origin of the coronavirus and the possibility of a lab leak origin. And maybe we can just play this soundbite here, where he talks about what he came up against trying to approach other American scientists about this possibility.
I did call up a person I knew who was an expert virologist, and I said, would you help me understand some of these papers that I'm reading? And he said, you're looking into whether this is a lab origin. And I said, that's right. And he said, Rich, he said, you know, my lab would get into serious trouble if we helped you. He said, China would find out, undoubtedly, and they would label us as enemies of China. That our lab collaborates with China on many things in virology. They're some of the best virologists in the world, and we would be blacklisted.
If you're enjoying this episode of Over the Target on YouTube, you can catch the full episode on Epoch TV.
Watch us exclusively at Epoch TV, where you'll find not only Over the Target, but all your favorite Epoch TV shows, like my colleague Brendon Fallon's Vital Signs.
Come get healthy with me on Vital Signs.